You'll notice this is one of these Sistine chapels. Right? There's his depiction of God, Adam, giving him the finger, giving him the whatever. I don't know. I'm not versed in this, but in any case, you'll notice this structure right around here. This is, who is this? Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci? One of those guys. Right. One of them, this was like the Renaissance. They were doing a lot of anatomy, right? They were like cutting up dead people and looking inside, makes them tick and everything. But you'll notice the shape of this thing around God, right? It's got this kind of weird shape around here, right? So he may have been suggesting something like this, right? If you look at the actual shape of a brain right here, right, it looks an awful lot like that, right? Because this is the source of like everything, your spirit, your soul, whatever you want to call it, right? This is your inner being, right? Your whole consciousness, everything about it is in this little chunk of meat right here, right? So it's, 3 pounds of meat or so, but it's very important, right? There's about 80 billion neurons, right? Nerve cells, which are going to be the functional part of nervous tissue. And each of those neurons is connected to a whole bunch of other neurons, such that there's 80 billion neurons, but they're connected to each other through 150 trillion synapses, right? So when you think of, if you know anything about computers, right, logic boards, there's all this connections in between these logic circuits and stuff. It's really, really complicated. And we don't really know precisely what's going on or how any of these connections and everything lead to consciousness, right? But that has nothing to do with what we're actually going to learn, don't worry. But it's just an interesting fact about it, right? That, back in the day, they didn't even think that the nervous system was made up like the rest of the body of cells, right? They just thought of some kind of electroplasmic fluid floating around in your body and causing all these sensations and stuff. But it is cells, they're talking to each other. And the complexity comes from these connections, right? The neurons that are talking to each other. There's 150 trillion synapses, right? That's a lot. So that is really complicated, right? How does it ever get there? How did it ever get there? Again, these are red dot things. You don't have to know any of this, right? But going way back, evolutionary speaking, life evolved as a single cell. It stayed as a single cell for like 1 billion, 2 billion years, right? Before it started growing into 2 cells and becoming more complex organisms. But way in the beginning, right, the cells had this ability to pick up some kind of environmental signal, because it had like little things embedded in its cell membrane, little receptors. Maybe it was detecting salt in some way. And when it detected a certain salt, it's going to move toward that salt. Or maybe this was heat receptors, and it was moving toward heat or away from heat, right? So it was going to sense something in the environment, salt, heat, toxins, whatever, right? Some kind of physical stimuli, and then do something about it, right? Move toward it, move away from it. That's a basic kind of function of life, right? The ability to respond, the irritability, as they say, right? That's a basic function. That's a single kind of cell, an amoeba of some sort. There's also those little bacteria. They float around in a pond, these certain ones called euglena, and they have a little flagella there that moves them around. But some of the things that they move around to is in response to picking up electromagnetic waves or photons that hit this photoreceptor, right? So light or reflection of light is hitting this little photoreceptor, and then the bacteria is going to do something about it. I don't know what it does. Maybe it moves away, maybe it moves toward it, maybe it starts photosynthesis, I don't know, but it does something toward it, right? Based on that stimuli. So there's a stimulation, and then there's a movement. In this case, it's a single cell. It's the whole cell doing this. And then when you get to multicellular organism, again, this is red dot, don't worry about this. When you get to multicellular organisms, right, you have a bunch of cells together and some like a sponge or something, or jellyfish. something like that. And you have a whole bunch of cells, and then embedded within the outside of the cell, you might have cells in here that detect stimuli and then move, right? These cells are doing other things. These cells detect some kind of stimuli, and maybe they contract and then they move the whole cell right there. And so these would be kind of like your muscle cells, but they can detect and react to stimuli, maybe heat, salt, whatever, touch, something like that. And then at some point, you start to get specialization, right? These cells that moved inside the body, moved to a different place. And then you had other cells embedded in the wall, right, of the outside wall that can detect stimuli of some sort. And then they're going to pass that information on to the cells that move. So you have this once removed from the outside environment. So these cells are moving, these cells are picking up information and making these cells move, right? Not moving themselves. Right, so these would be called sensory motor. They pick up the senses and they're making these muscle cells, primitive muscle cells move. Then, as things move along right there, you have cells that just pick up sensory information, and then they pass that on to other cells that are going to relay that signal to the actual contractile cells, right? So now you got this layers of information. And the advantage of that is you could put these anywhere in the body, and then they can connect to these cells anywhere in the body, and then these cells could be anywhere in the body. And then they could talk to each other and say, okay, I'm going to make this cell contract when I get a stimuli, but I'm also going to tell this cell not to contract or to contract, right? So you could have this cross communication here when you start to get this division of labor into like sensory cells, motor cells, and then those cells that might move, right? Even in the very simplest organisms, right? And this is basically what your nervous system is doing. Right? It's picking up information, it's going to integrate it in some way, and it's going to pass that information on to cells that actually do something about it, right? Make a movement or something like that in the environment. But the functions of the nervous system is to provide sensory input, detect some kind of external or internal stimuli somewhere on the body, somewhere outside the body or somewhere inside the body. And that information is going to be carried inside the central nervous system, so-called central nervous system. And the central nervous system is going to make sense of that sensory information based on all the input that it's getting. Basically what it's doing is building a picture of the world based on all the sensory information getting from your skin, from your eyes, from your ears. It's building a picture of the world, a virtual reality. And then you have this motor function, right, where you're going to actually do something about that information. You're going to be able to navigate because now you got a picture of the world. Now you're going to be able to navigate through it by moving those skeletal muscles or responding to making your internal stuff respond to internal changes. Now, these are basic functions of the nervous system. You got a sensory, a motor function, and then between, you are going to integrate all that information for a whole body coordinated response. So when I think of the nervous system, right, you want to think of this picture right here. This is a dissected nervous system. It took them like 8 years to dissect this out and cut away all the muscles and fat and stuff like that. Right? So what we're going to see with this is we're going to get, just like that very simple organism, we're going to have information coming in and then up to the brain for integration. And we're going to have information going out and doing something to the muscles right there, right? So, obviously this is the guy's head, this is his arm, right? And this gives you control, right, over your entire body, right, with this kind of information from all over the body and then controlling all over your body. And, right, you also have your guts in here like that can also be controlled by your internal sort of functions of your nervous system. So when you think of the nervous system, think of something concrete, because a lot of what you're looking at is like charts and stuff like that, or like very simple diagrams, but this is basically what's going on right here, right? Information, right, flowing in, through some kind of receptor, right, in the body, right? Maybe your ears, eyes, skin, all this stuff, bringing information in, and then moving your body in response in some way or another. Okay, so the first thing we want to do, because I'm going to be using words like central nervous system, right, and peripheral nervous system, is just to understand what that means, what the significance, if any, is, right? But when I talk about your central nervous system, right, we're just talking about your brain and your spinal cord, right? Your brain and your spinal cord. That's sitting inside the skull and your vertebral column. When we went over the bones, we went over your vertebrae. That, remember those vertebral foramen, right, going down the middle, that's where your spinal cord went down. And we already learned about all the skull, right? Your frontal, your parietal, your occipital skull bones, right? They're going to have corresponding names of parts of your brain in that. So everything inside your skull, protected by bone, is your central nervous system. And basically the job of your central nervous system is to get information from the outside and put it all together and then find something to do with it, right? Make your body move or glands secrete stuff, whatever, in response. Brain, spinal cord, simple as that. If it's inside bone like that, it's in the part of the central nervous system. It's not in direct contact with the outside. What is your peripheral nervous system, right? This is all the tissue outside the skull and vertebral column, right? So as soon as these wiring over here leave the vertebral column, right, they become nerves, right? Either spinal nerves going all around your body off the spinal cord, or the so-called cranial nerves that are going to go innervate your face and your head area and your special senses and stuff. Right? But this is just wiring, right? Wiring coming in from receptors, right? Picking up information from the environment, either eyes, ears, nose, skin, or internal stuff, and just bringing that information up for interpretation in the central nervous system. So you can have sensory information coming in, otherwise known as afferent information, right? Bringing in, this is more of that homeostasis language, right? Sensory, afferent division of the peripheral nervous system. Bringing information in, that's your input to your nervous system. And then you have a motor or efferent division. And along those same spinal nerves, you're going to have information going out, right? There's an output to your biceps brachii, to your flexor carpi radialis, or to your salivary glands or digestive glands or something like that, or your heart, something like that, something that's going to move stuff. Right? That's your peripheral nervous system, everything outside your skull and spinal cord, skull and vertebral column. Nerves and receptors, they're going to count this in this book. By the way, I should mention, every book I have categorizes all this stuff a little bit differently. So be loose with that. In other words, when you come to study for the T's or any other exam, make sure you look at their kind of material and how they kind of group things. I'm going by the book, even though I don't really like their classification so much, just so you guys have a more standard reading. So you can just read the book and make sure you just do whatever their book is saying. All right, so let's go back to our dissected nervous system. Brain, spinal cord, and then nerves, right? Information coming in, going out. So as we're moving along here, learning stuff, you want to take close note of the language we use and kind of pay attention and group things together in your brain. So when it comes to exam times, you see the word receptor, you're going to want to associate that with the sensory pathway. Or afferent, you're going to want to associate that with the sensory pathway, right? Or efferent, motor, effector, motor, right? So pay attention to all that. What's in the CNS, what's in the PNS, et cetera, et cetera. So group things together, and so you can help it, because it gets confusing. There's a lot of moving parts. But simplest way, if there's a little receptor out somewhere here by your finger, right, or down here by your knee, right, information is going to come in through that nerve and then into the central nervous system, into your spinal cord. Maybe there's a simple reflex, but maybe it goes up, ascends up toward the brain right here. So the pathway we'd be talking about, there's going to be receptor, right? It's going to go through sensory or afferent pathways into the spinal cord. It's going to ascend up to the brain, right? So all these words are associated with sensory right here. Starting with the receptor, and ending up the ascending pathway. And as we move along and learn more about the brain and the spinal cord, there'll be other words we're going to throw in there associated with this whole sensory pathway. And then there's, starting from the brain, somewhere in the brain, there's going to be descending information going out to, in this case, looks like your skeletal muscles to move them. The words you want to associate here are descending pathways, right? We're going to go these descending motor tracks down the spinal cord and through the brain. They're going to go out efferent fibers, right, through motor neurons, and they're going to eventually reach some kind of an effector. So you're going to want to associate these. We'll learn more words in the brain and the spinal cord that's going to be associated with the whole motor pathway. And then you notice that, we started in the periphery and went into the central nervous system. We started in the central nervous system, went out to the periphery. The central and peripheral nervous system is a little bit of an artificial kind of divide there, right? It's really all one big unit. It's just purely that the PNS part of it is all just cable. It's all just passing on information to and from the central nervous system. So here's another way to look at that whole thing with a chart, right? In your book, you got sensory information over here, right? Through these different ones, we're going to categorize as somatic. Big one, the big division will be between somatic and visceral. Your book, for some reason, doesn't put visceral in here, but I want to kind of add that in there because these two will be important, and I'll talk about what they mean. All right, but there's information coming from your external or internal environment, bring it in to the central nervous system, just like that picture I just showed you. Over here, your brain, your spinal cord, there's going to process information. And then at some point, you're going to go down those descending pathways for some kind of motor output. And the one I was describing before was more like a somatic one, where you're moving skeletal muscles. But there's also, in the motor output, there's also this whole other part of your nervous system that operates independent of your consciousness. And you are not independent of it, but you're not able to control what happens to your heartbeat or to your contraction of your smooth muscle or secretion of gland stuff, right? We won't talk about the enteric nervous system too much, but this will be all under voluntary or control here. This will be involuntary. So this is a somatic and your autonomic. This will also be known as your visceral motor, as we'll see. This will be the subject of a whole other lecture. In fact, 2 lectures at the end. But for right now, this is the basic divisions, right? Sensory versus motor. And again, their labeling is part of the periphery, but that sensory pathway is going to continue into the central nervous system, where it's going to be integrated. The motor pathway is going to start in the central nervous system, and that's going to go out those nerves, right, to go into its particular place, depending on which particular pathway you're looking at. I want to look at these right here first. Start at the sensory pathway and look at what, as part of the PNS, what kind of, how are we picking up information from the environment, right? So there's a couple different kinds of receptors, these sensory receptors. One of them is categorized as exteroceptors. That is basically, this is the things that are embedded within your skin that are picking up all sorts of anything that's pressing up against your body, right? You have certain light touch receptors embedded over here. You have deep touch receptors, like long, deep pressure receptors. You have receptors around your hair, so that when a bug is crawling on your arm and moves your hair, right, it can detect that movement of the hair. You have free nerve endings in your skin right here that are going to detect temperature or pain, right, or some kind of noxious stimuli within there, right? So it's picking up all of this information because your skin is in contact with the environment, right? So you want to know what's going on directly related to you. We also have those special sensory receptors and organs that are going to detect long range stimuli, right? So when electromagnetic waves are going into your eyeball, right? Electromagnetic waves, there's receptors on the back of your eyeball that are going to detect that, right? And then turn it into a signal toward the brain. When sound waves are going into your ear, right? That's going to detect that sound waves. And we'll talk a lot, actually, we'll go into details about how that signal is going to be interpreted and kind of transduced, as they say. When you eat something, there's chemical receptors over here. Or you smell something, and you're bringing it in your nose, right? There's little odorant receptors that pick up things in your brain and bring it into your brain, right? So it's picking up all this kind of, some of this is like long range molecules, like reflections of light from miles away or sound from miles away, or some of the stuff is like a chemical stuff. These would be all your sensory stuff. And we'll have a whole other lecture going over these briefly with a little more detail on the structure of the ear, right? But these are special sensory organs. So those would be kind of considered stuff we're conscious of, right? So I usually say somatic is, as far as the afferent pathway, is stuff we're aware of. And I'd include those sensory, your eyes, your ears, your taste and everything. Not everybody does, but we'll just lump that in as, that is stuff we're conscious of, stuff we're aware of, right? There's this whole other class of receptors embedded within your organs of your body, your heart, your stomach, your blood vessels, that are picking up information within there. And that information is going up into your brain, but you're really not conscious of it, right? All it's doing is monitoring your internal state of your body, right? So these would be interoceptors. Exteroceptors outside, interoceptors inside. So some examples of this are, there's our so-called chemoreceptors. They could pick up your blood pH level, right? Which is important. If your CO2 levels are too high, the blood acidity raises, and these receptors in there pick up that pH level, and they pass that information for your brain. Say, hey, this guy, we have too much CO2 in our body. Let's do something about it. Or maybe these baroreceptors that are going to pick up pressure, right? If there's too much or too little pressure in some of your blood vessels, this is going to go tell your brain that you got to do something about it. I want to increase or decrease pressure over here. There's too much. We're out of homeostatic range. So they're going to pick up that information. Visceral. When you see the word visceral, you should be thinking guts, right? Your heart, your lungs, your stomach, all that stuff inside your body. When you think of somatic, as far as sensory goes, you want to think your skin or those special things. Most of this you're not conscious of. Some things you are a little bit, but most of it, just think of it as unconscious behavior that's picked up by here. Is all to maintain kind of homeostasis internally. So here's some examples, right? CO2 increases in your blood when you are not breathing enough, or you're using, you're doing too much exercise, you're not getting enough oxygen, you're building up too much CO2 in your body. That's going to be picked up by the drop in pH, because CO2 will increase the blood acidity. So there's receptors in there that pick up, oh no, there's too much CO2 in here. Go to your brain and tell them to increase your breathing right here. Or, and this is something you'll do unconsciously right here, right? Or if there's not enough oxygen in the blood right over here, then the body knows that there should be a certain amount of oxygen. Oh no, go tell these things to also pick up the breathing. And then there'll be an output to your rib cage muscles and your diaphragm to tell you to breathe a little heavier, because these are doing it, right? But that's all because we can pick up our internal environment here. So that is your receptor part of it, right? Your somatic, sensory, nerve fiber, in this case, the somatic or visceral ones, picking up information, bringing it into the body. Again, there's an integrative center over here that might do something, and then we're going to go back and eventually have some kind of effect by making some kind of movement, right? So this will be part of your motor or efferent division.